So again, this is Sid Haas with LKCS. I am the Vice President of Business Development here, and today's presentation is going to cover DDoS attacks and what to do about them. We have done quite a bit of research and planning regarding DDoS attacks for the last few months. So the goal of today's webinar is really to give you quite a bit of information about DDoS attacks, what they are, and then give you some ideas of what types of protection are available, and then also give you some ideas of what we're doing and how we are helping credit unions mitigate and protect themselves from DDoS attacks as well. For those of you who are not familiar with LKCS, this is a little chart that gives you some information about the variety of services that we offer. The company was founded back in the early 1960s and has been working with financial institutions since that time. All of our products and services are geared specifically to credit unions and small banks. So we provide a wide variety of marketing services, web development, web hosting services, statement processing, and e-statement services. And a lot of work that we do deals with data and our clients' data and the availability to that data. So as these DDoS attacks become more prevalent, we felt it was necessary both to protect our systems and to provide protection for our credit unions against these DDoS attacks. So we think that this type of IT security solution fits very well with what we're doing and the services that we already provide for our clients. So I'm going to jump right into DDoS attacks and what is a DDoS attack. And for those of you that don't know, DDoS stands for a distributed denial of service attack. And the whole concept of a denial of service attack is to deny a service. So these attackers' goal is to basically make your website, and any web applications such as home banking, bill pay, things like that, make them inaccessible to your users. And the reason that the word distributed is in front of it is because now these attackers have the ability to distribute these attacks across many computers and many internet connections. So we're talking thousands and millions, potentially of different computers can make web requests to your web servers and your firewalls and different systems to basically overwhelm them. And these attacks have the ability to consume all of the internet bandwidth available, not only just to your website or to your credit union, but actually to entire data centers and large segments of the internet. So, and the one key piece at the bottom of this slide that you'll see is there is no way to actually prevent a DDoS attack. So you can protect yourselves from them, and you can obviously have plans in place to deal with those attacks when they occur, but there's absolutely no way to prevent a DDoS attack against your website or your web applications. So we're going to talk about a little bit about how these attacks are put together and how easy it is, unfortunately, for these attackers to actually attack your website. But, the first phase, I guess, of a DDoS attack is what we call target acquisition. The person that's attacking you has chosen to attack you. They're going to identify the company, the organization, the data center, the specific server, whatever it is that they want to attack. And there could be any reasons for that attack. They could be financial. There's obviously a lot, of the political type, what they call hacktivism now is a very popular term, where people are trying to make a political case for, against a specific organization or a specific company. And unfortunately, it can be just for malicious fun. I mean, these attacks are, as you'll see in a few minutes, they're very, very easy to begin. They're inexpensive in a lot of cases. So it's really just somebody that has a bone to pick, unfortunately, with a specific company or a specific bank or a specific credit union, has the tools that they need to actually bring that website, and make it unavailable. So phase two is the groundwork. Typically now with these distributed denial of service attacks, at least the larger ones, there's typically a lot of malicious software, malware, and spyware that basically use unprotected computers to develop and build these botnets. So there's thousands of computers, typically home machines with broadband internet connections. Obviously, everybody's availability to high-speed internet connections that continues to get better and better. These internet connections are faster and faster. Well, what that all means is that now the attack size, or the potential size of these attacks, is also growing. And the more computers, that one of these attackers can compromise and use as part of their attack, the larger these attacks can grow. And these hackers, they're not stupid. They're actually very, very smart. Unfortunately, they're just using their experience for malicious purposes. But they bring a lot of skill and a lot of expertise to these attacks, and they market together. They discuss these attacks, they network together, and they can then use each other's botnets and even rent their botnets by the hour, which is a pretty scary thing. And then phase 3 is they actually initiate the attack. So they build their botnets, they compromise these computers, they assemble these network of infected machines that are now known as zombie computers, and they send their commands to attack their target, with typically legitimate web requests that just overwhelm the servers, choke the bandwidth, overwhelm firewalls, overwhelm routers, and just either attack the network infrastructure itself or the website behind it or the web application. We'll talk about different types of attacks as well. But basically just know that once they launch this attack, they can decide how long the attack lasts. And right now, typically, it's basically as long as they can afford, because they're renting these botnets, and it's just a matter of, how long they can afford to keep that attack up and how well you mitigate that attack. Because one of the things that we found, and that all of the experts that we've talked to have found, is once one of these attacks start, they'll change, and we'll talk about this, as we go as well. But they'll change from one attack platform to the next, to the next. But eventually they'll figure out that your site is protected, from these types of denial of service attacks, and they'll move on to the next target. They're not going to continue to spend money to attack a website that they're not really having an effect on. So those are important things to consider as well. Just to give you an idea of the scale of these botnets is that, once these attacks start, a botnet can actually generate, and this is a pretty common number, at least 1 million times the available bandwidth of a business. So a lot of people's approach to DDoS attacks is, well, we're just going to buy more bandwidth. Well, unfortunately, you can't potentially buy enough bandwidth to protect yourself from that kind of a ratio. That seems like 64,000 PCs is a large number, but it only takes 64,000 PCs that are infected with a virus like Conficker to generate 10 gigabits per second of traffic in a DDoS attack. 10 gigabits of an internet connection is a huge internet connection. There's very large data centers that that may have less than that, certainly a little bit more than that in some cases, but that's a huge amount of traffic that they can generate. And to give you an idea, the largest botnet was one that went by the name of Mariposa, and it affected 12 million PCs. So these attackers had access to a network of 12 million infected PCs, and could have potentially generated a DDoS attack as large as over 30 terabytes per second. An attack that large has never been launched and would bring the internet, to its knees. Not just a particular, an individual website, but large segments of the internet would be unavailable if that type of an attack was launched. These attacks are extremely easy, unfortunately, for people to launch. Now, there's, some of the easier to launch attacks are also the easier to prevent. But this is an example that I wanted to share, and there's actually a few others. This is what's known as the low orbit ion cannon attack. And this is literally an application that you can download off of the internet, run on your PC, run on your network of PCs, determine who you want to attack. There's even a slider to indicate the size of the attack. You can choose what protocols you want to attack on a website and just launch that attack. So you don't have to know anything about what's behind the low orbit ion cannon or how it works, but if you want to attack an unprotected website, you can literally just put in the domain name or the IP address of the site you want to attack and launch that attack just by downloading this application. This is not the only one. There's other ones. There's the silent DDoSer. There's this PHP DOS attack. There's Janidos. There's just all these open source, essentially, hacker applications that, somebody that has, like I said, before, something against you, or that, they're upset with you for any reason, they can literally go download one of these applications and launch it against your website. These are some of the easier ones to protect yourself against, but in most cases, you may not be protected today. And we'll talk about that as we go forward as well. So I'm not going to get overly technical, hopefully not, but I do want to describe the types of attacks that are out there. I know there's a lot of IT administrators, network administrators that are attending the session today. So just to give you an idea of the different types of attacks there are volume-based attacks. So you guys are familiar with terms like UDP floods and ICMP floods, but they're trying to flood your website or your internet connection with traffic. And they're just going to saturate that bandwidth, and these types of attacks are measured in bits per second, or megabits per second, terabits per second, whatever, gigabits per second, whatever those terms are. It's all measured in bits per second. There are specific protocol attacks, such as SYN floods and the ping of death that we've all heard of, where it's just taking and trying to attack one specific protocol, in your IP stack, one specific port, typically. And these types of attacks are measured in packets per second. So it's not necessarily overwhelming all of the bandwidth, but it's really attacking a specific piece of equipment, a load balancer, a firewall, or, a specific port on a server, and just hitting that one area until that entire system can no longer respond. And there are application layer attacks, and these are actually the more sophisticated attacks, but these are the things that are going after specific vulnerabilities in your web browser, in your web servers, specific vulnerabilities in the programming of your websites or your web applications, and the magnitude is measured here in requests per second. So, in this case, they're identifying things within, again, either the actual web server itself and the way that was, written, or vulnerabilities inherent in that, or the way that your website or web application was programmed. So even things like SQL injection attacks are an example of an application layer attack. And any good DDoS mitigation or protection solution, will need to at least be able to protect you from those three main types of attacks. And keep in mind, and I mentioned this already, when your website or your web application is under attack, the actual person attacking, the DDoS attacker, is very likely to change attack profiles as you begin to mitigate that attack. If they're not able to, to block the site by, one of the UDP flood attacks, they may change to a SYN flood attack. They may eventually change to an application layer attack like a slow LoRa's type attack. But they're going to continue to change their tactics to determine what protections you have in place. And like I said, in a lot of cases, your goal is to mitigate those attacks long enough for them to decide to move on to the next target that's not as well protected. These DDoS attacks, they're making the news, obviously. Many of you have seen, seen the articles. We've obviously shared many of them with our clients as well. But the growth of these attacks is truly staggering. I haven't seen anything yet for Q1 2013, but just comparing the fourth quarter of 2012 to the third quarter, just in that 3-month period, there was over a 27% increase in the total number of attacks. And you'll see how in every one of these categories, the percentage increase and the size of these attacks, the number of attacks, what they were attacking. And China is still obviously, retains its position as the leader in the world for originating DDoS attacks. But unfortunately, we can't just block. And I get this question a lot. Well, we can just block the entire country of China, and that's fine until you have members that are, traveling to China, or that are in the armed forces in China, or whatever it might be. It's just not a realistic thing to block a major section of the world, or a major country like that, just because they happen to be, the primary source or the leading source of these attacks. These attackers, by the way, can also spoof their locations. So, just by blocking an IP address doesn't necessarily, block an attacker in China from attacking your website, as either. So I do have some polls. Rather than me doing all the talking, I want to get some idea from you guys about what you think of DDoS attacks. So based on the information that you've read and you've seen, I would really like to know how likely you think your company will become a victim of a DDoS attack in the next 12 months. So if you could go ahead and answer those, the poll question, I'll close the poll and I'll share the results with everybody as the results come in. So I'll give you a few more seconds to answer. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and then share the results with everybody. So you can actually see kind of what we would have expected, that about half of you feel it's likely and about half of you feel it's not likely. Looks like there's a couple of people that have already unfortunately been the victim of a DDoS attack. And I hope you have solutions in place to mitigate those. But this is, typical of what we see when we're talking to our clients as well. Nobody knows. Nobody wants to be the next victim of an attack. Hopefully if you felt you were very likely, you would already have protection in place. If it was very likely that you were going to be under attack. But you're all obviously seeing how these attacks are ramping up both in frequency and size. So you can see that it's a potential, that you would be under attack. And the fact that nobody answered that it wouldn't happen to, that it won't happen to you at all. At least nobody on the webinar today has their head in the sand thinking that this just isn't going to happen. So we don't feel that small to mid-sized credit unions are at high risk of these attacks either. But we'll talk about that further as we go as well. So thank you very much for participating in that poll. All right. So to give you an idea of what a DDoS attack could potentially cost, your organization, these are the four primary areas of cost. Damage to your brand. For those marketing people that are attending this session today, you've spent years building up your brand. The IT people on the call today, you've made every effort you can to make sure your website is as available as it can be. And your home banking systems and things are as available as they can be, because you realize that's how, your account holders are doing business with you. And when your site goes down, you lose revenue. Obviously, most of the people on the call today are not necessarily e-commerce type, retail stores. But even when your home banking systems and online, and bill pay systems and online loan applications and account opening systems, when those are unavailable, you're losing revenue. And I'll show you some numbers, to see how much revenue potentially you might be losing. But what it all comes down to is you're providing bad member and customer experience, right? You're providing bad member service and bad customer service. While it's not your intention, that's the end result when your website is not available. So depending on how long your website is down, and some of the recent attacks that we'll talk about, websites were down for a day and a half in some cases. That will frustrate your account holders, and they could potentially then seek alternatives. And obviously the fourth cost is the cost to protect the site and mitigate these attacks as they happen. Unfortunately, or I guess maybe the good thing in this case, is those mitigation costs are actually the smallest segment of those costs. The actual money that you need to spend to mitigate the attacks is much less than what an attack would cost you, and the damage to your brand, the loss of revenue, and the account holder experience. And the numbers that we've seen, and these numbers are higher. This is for small and mid-sized organizations. The numbers are much higher for the large banks and credit unions. But the numbers that we've seen published are, are that a DDoS attack can cost a victim organization as much as $10,000 to $50,000 per hour in lost revenue. So I don't know if I believe that number or not, but those are the numbers that we've seen in numerous studies and numerous articles and white papers and things that we've researched and read regarding DDoS attacks. I'm going to just give you one more reason why these DDoS attacks, why you need to protect yourself from them, and that is that these DDoS attacks are much more frequently being used to hide actual security breaches and data theft. These attackers are drawing your attention on the attack and drawing your attention away from your intrusion detection systems. They're generating massive log files. So even while you have, you're currently analyzing your log files, either in real time or, on a regular basis, these log files get massive and they get too difficult for you to analyze quickly. So by the time you find evidence of an intrusion, it was way in the past. So it's too late for you to prevent that intrusion. In a lot of cases, what we've seen with these DDoS attacks is people are trying to mitigate them on their own. They're rebooting their servers and their routers, and they're destroying potentially that forensic evidence to even identify the attack happened, how it happened, what data was taken, those types of things. And and the end result, like I said, is that these attacks end long before any potential intrusion was identified. So. The good thing is the majority of attacks are not being used this way, but it is a growing portion of these DDoS attacks. And another reason why you need to have dedicated DDoS protection in place so that your other systems can continue to do what they do and protect you and notify you of any data intrusion and data loss. So honestly, my intention today is not to scare you, but as I've done all of this research and as we've read on these DDoS attacks, I do want to share a few more statistics. And right now, what we're seeing is that worldwide, we're up to about 130,000 DDoS attacks per day. The majority of those aren't making the news, but that is a staggering number. We're not talking a handful of attacks, a few thousand attacks. I mean, the number, and this number was from VeriSign. Is that they're currently up to 130,000 DDoS attacks per day is what's happening now. And these attacks are growing at exponential rates. I mean, the Spam House attack that made the news, last week or the week before was the largest attack to date, anywhere in the world. And that attack generated 300 gigabits per second in traffic. The company that was mitigating the attack couldn't keep up with it. They didn't have 300 gigabits of bandwidth. They did an amazing job, but they ended up, getting bandwidth essentially from Google, Microsoft, some of the largest, web presences, in the country. And they actually, basically the network in London was the most, congested worldwide. But internet traffic worldwide slowed down on the 27th as that attack got larger and larger. There were numerous companies that were mitigating that attack, diverting traffic just to keep, the internet working correctly, and amazingly to keep Spam House up. They were not, their service was severely affected, but they were not down throughout that attack. So, but it took a it took a small army of people to protect Spam House from that attack. The good news is that 90% of DDoS attacks are smaller than 1 gigabit per second. So while the largest attack was 300 gigabits per second, and I'm sure there's going to be a new record set within the next month or two, is my guess. But the vast majority of attacks are much smaller than that and much more realistic for companies to mitigate. So let's talk for a few minutes about the latest attacks on banks and credit unions, because that's why you guys are obviously here, attending the webinar. The largest banks and credit unions have recently been the victims of attacks. It's been in the news for the last couple of months. Primarily, at least who's claiming that they've done it, or this, is this organization of the cyber fighters that we've heard about. But the U.S. government has come out and said it's most likely sponsored by the nation state of Iran. The country of Iran is sponsoring and funding and keeping these attacks going in an effort to bring the financial sector, to cost the financial sector money and availability here in the U.S. They claim that obviously that it's for retaliation for an anti-Muslim video. We've all seen, the opinions that, there's no way that that's all it can be, that now this, this video, there's hundreds or thousands of copies of it on the internet, so even if the video is taken off of YouTube that they're complaining about, the video is still alive. And, so it's really just a political attack. most likely, by Iran. Whether anybody will be able to prove it or prosecute it is likely doubtful, as you know, but that's where it's coming from. To me, however, and my opinion is that who did it and why is really less important than the fact that it could be done. We've seen, banks and credit unions that were protected or thought they were protected from DDoS attacks, and some that didn't. They weren't protected, but those websites went down. Some of them went down for 4 hours. Some of them went down for 2 days. And they were down for as long as it took for them to successfully mitigate that attack and then bring their websites back, up. So their brand reputation suffered, revenue was lost. Obviously, none of those banks or credit unions wanted to make the news for that reason, and the end result was, the NCUA issuing their memo and alerting credit unions nationwide again about DDoS attacks and asking you to identify what protections you have in place on your website. These attacks are going to continue. Aviva Latam, who's a vice president for Gartner, said that and showed it, and we keep seeing it month after month, week after week. How there's more and more attacks. They're getting larger and larger. He said this at the end of the year, but he proclaimed that these attacks against U.S. banks in the second half of 2012 were going to continue into 2013. And that, you're going to need to employ a layered approach, that combines multiple denial of service defenses, to prevent these attacks from bringing your websites down. So what we learned from these attacks were that the firewalls and intrusion detection systems that all of you have in place, that all of us have in place, really are ineffective at DDoS protection. They provide limited protection for smaller attacks, but as those attacks get larger, the dedicated firewalls and the intrusion detection systems, they're good at what they do, but they don't mitigate DDoS attacks. They have rule sets certainly for some denial of service attacks, but as those attacks come up in bandwidth and consume all of the bandwidth available to them, they're going to overwhelm, the processors and everything involved with your firewall and intrusion detection systems. The more traffic that's generated from these attacks, those systems crash and were taken offline completely, and were just ineffective at the DDoS protection. And then some of these larger banks and credit unions that had dedicated DDoS appliances, hardware specifically designed to mitigate DDoS attacks, didn't have the staff trained well enough to use them effectively. So they could mitigate some attacks and some types of attacks, but as those attack profiles changed, as the attacks ramped up, even those internal systems, those dedicated DDoS systems, if they didn't have the expertise behind them, the large banks and credit unions still, their sites were still affected and became unavailable. And we realize that most of you on the call today aren't one of these largest, large banks or largest credit unions. But we feel, and I think with the NCUA, the reason behind their warning is that the smaller financial institutions are even more vulnerable. These attackers, and they're already beginning to see that the large banks and credit unions have protection, have gone out and purchased additional protection now, and their websites and their applications are going to be protected from these DDoS attacks. Well, it's going to flow downhill, unfortunately, and they're going to know that the small and mid-sized financial institutions don't necessarily have the budgets to spend on in-house DDoS protection, especially that you won't need. I mean, we looked at the survey and how 50% of you felt that it wasn't likely that you were going to become the victim of an attack in the next 12 months. Well, you take that, then are you going to allocate budget funds, against, for the purpose of purchasing DDoS protection, especially, significant funds to go out and purchase, hardware or software to bring in-house and the expertise to bring in-house to mitigate those attacks. And you also have limited bandwidth. I mean, it doesn't matter how much internet bandwidth you have. You could have a 50 meg connection. You could have a fiber connection. You could up to a gigabit. It doesn't matter how much bandwidth you have at your bank or credit union. The DDoS attackers are going to have more. We saw the numbers at the beginning of the presentation relating to the botnets and the amount of potential traffic, internet traffic and requests that those botnets can make, back to your web servers and back to your data centers. There's no way that you can, have enough bandwidth and afford enough bandwidth to protect yourself, from those scale, from that scale of attack. So what can you do about DDoS attacks? I want to discuss the different options that you have that are available for you to protect yourself from DDoS attacks. Again, you can't prevent them, but you can protect yourself and mitigate the attacks when they happen. So the first we've already discussed a little bit are the traditional in-house, the techniques you already have. So your firewalls and your intrusion prevention systems, the things you already have in place that are providing some web security, a lot of web security, for your websites. But they typically only work for certain types of small-scale attacks. The cost of the hardware and a little bit of additional bandwidth and things, and you can certainly use those to mitigate, small attacks. But keep in mind that they're not deployed specifically for DDoS protection. And the event of one of these larger scale attacks, and a large scale, larger scale attack meaning, even a 500 megabit to a gigabit attack, those systems will probably not be able to handle that kind of traffic coming at them. There are dedicated DDoS appliances, as I mentioned, that some of the larger banks and credit unions already had in place. They have a very high upfront cost, and they also have a very high cost to continue to maintain them because of the fact that these new attacks are coming out, new profiles are coming out that continue to need to be updated on these appliances. And depending on how many locations you have and where your internet connections are, how many different internet connections you have, how many routers you have, all those types of things, you may need to put multiple DDoS appliances in place, and that's even just from one vendor. So you may need multiple vendors' appliances to mitigate different types of attacks. So is it even feasible to bring these DDoS appliances in? And they do need extensive support and they do need expensive expertise. But there are appliances, just like you have firewalls and intrusion protection systems, there are many vendors that provide, specific appliances for DDoS mitigation. And obviously you have your ISPs and your web hosting companies. So if you have your, many of you have LKCS host your websites. Many of you have your websites hosted elsewhere, and we rely on those traditional firewalls and intrusion systems. All the ISPs and web hosting companies do. They have protection for limited attack types. We certainly have more bandwidth that we can use, and we have larger firewalls and larger intrusion detection systems. But at the same time, a large attack is going to end up making your site be what we call black holed. We're going to divert the traffic from your website, and I say we, I mean collectively web hosts and ISPs are going to divert the traffic from large attacks so that they can protect the rest of the sites that they're hosting, the rest of the servers in their data center, the rest of the bandwidth that they have until that attack either ends or is mitigated. Talk to your web hosting companies and your ISPs and your core processors, and any place you have a hosted servers in a data center somewhere. Find out what the limitations are that they have against DDoS attacks. We have limited protection that we provide our clients, our web hosting clients, for DDoS attacks, but large-scale DDoS attacks will end up making that site unavailable so that we can maintain access to the other sites that we're hosting, the other servers that we have, and honestly, the other servers in the data center where we host. So another option that you have are what's known as content distribution networks. For those of you with large websites, you may be familiar with them. A content distribution server network was not designed for a DDoS attack. It was designed to prevent or to provide faster access to your web content. And the way it works is these content distribution networks have points of presence or servers all around the world at various data centers, and they cache the static content of your website. So wherever a request is made from, that request is going to be directed to the server that's geographically closest to where that request was coming from, and then able to deliver that web content back faster than that request being sent back to the originating server. It works, content distribution works great for static content, and for huge websites. Amazon could not exist without a content distribution network. large websites like that. But even many, banks and credit unions do use content distribution networks for the static content on their websites. And when I say static content, it can be, all the logos and the background images and the text that doesn't change. But when they're actually a request for, a home banking request, or that variable data, that's going back, that request is still going back to the origination servers to bring that data. But just by their very design, content distribution networks, because they're distributing that content, does provide some protection against DDoS attacks. There are limits, and obviously they can't protect that origin server. So even with a content distribution network, those application-specific attacks, still have the ability to render your site, at least, the home banking and types of applications, bill pay applications, and online loan applications, those types of things can still be made unavailable by a denial of service attack, even with a content distribution network. And then finally, and probably the solution that we feel is the best one for you to consider, are cloud-based mitigation services. By taking the DDoS mitigation and putting it in the cloud, you can reduce your costs. There's no hardware for you to purchase. There's no software for you to purchase. The expertise is, housed by that cloud-based service provider. And these cloud-based providers, and there's several of them. There's many of them, and many of them are very good. And we'll talk about some, as we go, in the presentation as well. But they provide a multi-layered approach to DDoS mitigation. They have some of these dedicated appliances, but they have several of them from multiple providers. They're also going to be able to provide real-time monitoring. While that mitigation is going on, they're going to be able to show you how much traffic is being generated by the attack, how much they're cleaning out, how much clean traffic they're returning back to your website. And then after that attack, they're going to be able to provide a report to tell you exactly what happened, how you were attacked, who attacked you, all those types of things, which we feel is really important. But for the IT infrastructures that we feel that small and mid-sized banks and credit unions have, we feel pretty strongly after all of the research that we've done that a cloud-based mitigation, DDoS mitigation service is definitely something that you should consider. So things to look for in a DDoS solution is obviously experience and expertise. That's going to be the first thing. The company that you're hiring, the appliance that you're purchasing, whatever it might be, how much experience do they have with these DDoS attacks? What expertise do they bring to the table? Those types of things. What is the bandwidth and scrubbing capacity? How large of an attack can these people actually mitigate? Again, I don't anticipate any of you on the call today becoming the victim of a 300 gigabit per second attack like Spamhaus, but can the provider that you choose or the bandwidth that you have in-house, for your appliance that you're purchasing, can you handle a 500 megabit per second attack, a gigabit attack, a 2 gig attack, a 5 gig attack, a 10 gig attack, whatever it might be? What is the overall scrubbing capacity? What types of attacks and diversity of attacks can the solution mitigate? Do you need more than one solution to mitigate against all of those attacks that we talked about earlier in the presentation? What technologies are deployed? We've found that the best of breed DDoS mitigation solutions utilize multiple technologies from multiple vendors, and they put it in a layered approach to mitigate these attacks. So what technologies do they have deployed? How long is it going to take to mitigate an attack, and is that backed by a service level agreement? We're going to talk about the time to mitigate and what you can expect from these types of services, and obviously what's the cost. What does the mitigation cost? Is there a monthly fee? What is it? Is it a per incident fee for each time you're attacked? Is there a bandwidth charge, for the attack size? How many domains or resources, subdomains, all those types of things, how many IP addresses, all those things, what can be protected at that cost? And is there SSL protection? A lot of your websites, the credit union and bank websites, and the entire site in many cases is protected by an SSL security certificate. Well, that site is now encrypted, meaning that even if we wanted to look at the traffic to determine what is being attacked, it's encrypted and we can't decrypt it. So these types of attacks, called layer 7 attacks, now require us to have a copy, or the mitigation, service that you're using, to have a copy of your SSL certificate so they can decrypt the traffic and look inside of it to determine exactly how that attacker is attacking your website to be able to mitigate that. Well, is that type of SSL protection, that layer 7 protection, is that included? Is it even available in your DDoS solution? And are there overage charges? I was amazed as I did my research and we worked on this for the last couple of months. We would look at solutions that seemed very affordable. Seemed like it had everything that we would want in a solution, would be a great solution for many of our clients. And then we realized, well, gee, if they had a larger attack, or went over this threshold, whatever it is, the costs can get enormous. I mean, it's amazing how fast they grow. The costs, with these overage charges can grow exponentially. So as you're researching DDoS mitigation solutions, pay very close attention to the potential overage charges in particular, because it's an area that we feel can be a gotcha on a lot of the solutions that we've seen. So I'm going to talk for a second more, or a few minutes more, about the cloud-based mitigation solutions that are available, because there's actually about 3 categories of them, even when we talk about just cloud-based mitigation solutions. So the first option that you have is choosing a cloud-based mitigator or a cloud-based mitigation solution that is what we call always on. All of your web traffic is always going to be filtered through the DDoS provider. Okay. The good thing is that mitigation can begin as soon as a potential attack is identified. That attack may not have even started yet, or maybe just be in the infancy of the attack, and the web provider, the DDoS provider, can see that, notify you of it, and begin mitigation immediately with absolutely no downtime. The downside is that a dedicated server and router is going to be required. These types of always-on solutions may not be available with shared web hosting. You may have to have your own web server, which a lot of you don't have, or may not have. And always-on protection is typically expensive. So it's not necessarily prohibitively expensive. It's one of those things you need to decide if you need or not. A second option is what we call an on-demand mitigator. So in that case, your web traffic is proceeding just like it does now. It goes direct to your web servers and your routers and your firewalls. And then when you come under attack, you actually divert all of your web traffic to the company that's mitigating that attack for you. And that mitigation begins as soon as that traffic is diverted. Typically what we see in these services is that you can expect about 5 to 15 minutes of downtime once that mitigator begins to see that data coming across, they're coming across the wire. It's available for any type of website or web application, and it's definitely more economical than an always-on solution. I see a question popped in about what do we mean by expensive or economical. I'm going to show you some numbers in a second just so you can get an idea of what the costs are. Because, yeah, my definition of expensive and economical may be very different than some of yours. And I want to just give you the third option here, and that is emergency mitigation. We feel that some of our customers and other credit unions and banks may decide, you know what, we're going to take our chances. We're going to roll the dice, and if we become under attack, I'm going to know who to call right away for an emergency mitigation. And these mitigations can still begin, within several minutes of traffic diversion, but most of them take a little bit longer. What we see typically for downtime, even in an emergency mitigation solution, is about a 4-hour window of downtime. It can be more or less depending on the different providers and depending on some different issues, but about 4 hours of downtime. It's available for any website, but they do have you. These providers do have you over a barrel. Because they know that you're in trouble. They know that you're being attacked. They know they can get a premium out of you. They are going to get an emergency setup fee. In most cases, we've seen emergency setup fees that are enormous. I'm going to show you again some numbers. And again, just the cost, just because they know that you're in a predicament, in a bind, need something right away. It's going to be a very expensive Way to go. They got you. So I'm going to throw one more little poll question up here, and based on what you've learned so far, what of these DDoS mitigation options do you feel is the best for your institution? I'll give you another few seconds to answer, and then I'll share the results. And again, I think this is, in line with what we're thinking as well, that most banks and credit unions are probably going to want an on-demand type solution that's going to be more affordable, but yet provide, that protection when they need it, with only a few minutes of potential downtime. So, and there are going to be larger institutions that need the always-on protection or want the always-on protection, and there are going to be some that just, like I said, are willing to roll the dice and gamble a little bit, and able to live with the fact that their website can be down for a few hours in the event of an attack. So let me go back to the presentation. All right. So there is one thing that you should do now, whether you're under attack or not under attack, whether you have a DDoS mitigation plan in place, whether you don't, whether you're ready to buy one, whether you're not. And that is, and this is a fairly technical term, and I'll try to explain it as best I can, but we highly recommend that you reduce the TTL on your DNS A records. So for those of you that have no idea what I'm talking about, let me explain. So when you are under, when you become the victim of a DDoS attack, if you're using a cloud-based service, you're going to need to redirect your website traffic to the company that's going to mitigate that attack. And that is done by changing the IP address that your domain name points to. So right now, if I go to www.myfinancialinstitution.com, that's going to translate over the domain name system to an IP address of wherever that web server is. And my request is going to go to that web server, and that web server is going to try to answer me. Well, that domain name system, the DNS system of the internet in general, maintains that directory of domain names to IP addresses, and those are called A records. So when I make a request to a website, I'm making a request for the A record to get the IP address that I want my request to go to. These IP addresses, these A records are cached by DNS servers all over the world for a specific period of time. And that time is known as the TTL, or the time to live. How long is that IP address going to stay in that cache? And that's so that wherever my request is made from, it can very quickly determine how it needs to route through the internet around the world to get to the web server. The longer that time is cached, the less those requests have to come back to the primary DNS server that you have for your domain to get any updates. You can control that TTL value, or whoever maintains your DNS for your domain name can control that TTL value. It's a value that's just listed in seconds. A long TTL, like I was saying, is going to enable these DNS servers to cache the IP address for your website for several hours or even a certain number of days. And it's going to reduce the number of requests made to your primary DNS host. However, even if you change where that IP address points to, some of these servers around the world are going to continue to send people to the old IP address until that TTL expires. So if your domain, for example, or your A record has a TTL of 259,200, that means that IP address is going to be cached for 3 days. If you become the victim of an attack today, it can be up to 3 days before all of your traffic is diverted to the DDoS mitigation provider. It's not a good situation to be in. Some, those caches are going to be, the DNS servers are going to cache these things at different times. So some traffic, can be redirected quickly, but some is going to live out there as long as 3 days. A shorter TTL, such as a TTL of 300, which is only 5 minutes, will enable you to make that change and will redirect all of your website requests to that new IP address much faster. However, it is also going to increase the load on your primary DNS server. So for very large organizations, that's a significant, point. And for a lot of web hosts and DNS hosts, they don't necessarily support TTLs as low as 300. So it's something that you're going to need to talk to whoever hosts your DNS. So who manages your DNS? You do, is one possibility. Your ISP or your web host, such as LKCS, is another possibility. Some of you, your core processor or your home banking provider host your DNS. Sometimes it's whoever you registered your domain name with, and sometimes your computer consultant. And what we've seen with some of the websites that we develop and redesign and things for clients is your prior consultant still hosts your DNS. But you want to find out who manages your DNS, and we highly recommend that it's somebody that you have a very close relationship with if you don't do it yourself. So you need to find out who manages that DNS. You need to ask them if there is a minimum TTL value that they will let you have. And you also want to make sure that that TTL value will not revert to a default value on its own. One of the things that we found is that many of the major data centers and major home, web hosting providers, they'll let you change your TTL. They'll let you change it down to a low value, but a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, regardless of what you set it to, it's going to revert to a higher number. So you want to make sure that if you can change it to a lower number, that it can stay there. You want to know what your TTL value is. What is your time to live on your DNS record? And you're going to want to change them if necessary. We recommend a value, by the way, of between 300 and 600, which means that within 5 to 10 minutes, your traffic is going to be diverted. All of it is going to be diverted to your mitigation provider. And you can change DNS providers if needed. It's not expensive. DNS is not, necessarily a very expensive thing at all. And we can help. So if you're not sure who manages your DNS or what I'm talking about here at all, I can get our web developers and our network guys here to help you get a handle on it. And we can even provide DNS hosting services for you at very low rates. So before I show you some of the costs, I do want to get an idea of whether you have budgeted yet or are considering budgeting for DDoS mitigation services. So this is the last poll that I'm going to show, and then I'm going to get into some of the numbers so you can see what's out there. I'll give you a few more seconds to answer, and then I'll show these poll results as well. All right. So there you can see the results. And obviously DDoS protection has only made the news for the last, month or two, at least on an ongoing basis. DDoS attacks have been around for years, but the scale of them has just been unprecedented in the numbers lately. So it's not surprising at all to me that most of you have not yet budgeted for DDoS mitigation. And I'm looking forward to talking to the 5% that do have funds allocated. So just to give you an idea, again, these numbers don't surprise me, but that's what's out there industry wide. So let me go back to the presentation and share some rough figures with you. So what does DDoS mitigation cost? That was the question we had before, and honestly, in all of the research that I've done, and I've literally talked to several dozen DDoS mitigation providers, Tim and I have, it's the wild, wild west out there is the best thing that I can say. Pricing varies very, very widely. So, but the one thing that I can warn you about is so does the quality of the DDoS mitigation service. So you'll find bargains out there, or what look like bargains, until you start talking to them about what they actually provide. what those potential overage charges are, things like that, and then the bargains don't necessarily stay bargains all the time. So pricing does vary widely, but let me give you some ideas of what we see as far as some rough numbers. So the always-on protection, that option where all of your traffic is diverted to your DDoS mitigation provider. Typically what we see is it starts at $2,000 a month and it goes up from there. I mean, we've seen as high as $10,000 to $15,000 to $18,000 a month for some services. It really depends on the amount of traffic that your website gets. But for the small and mid-size organizations, it's going to start, for the smaller ones, it'll be in the $2,000 a month range, and then it'll go up from there. On-demand protection, what we see is that typically starts at $700 a month. Again, for the smaller ones, it's all based on the amount of clean traffic, the amount of traffic that your website gets without being under attack in most cases. So you can guess that starts at about $700 a month. But for those solutions that have an attack mitigation charge, in other words, when you actually come under attack, they're going to charge you to mitigate that attack. We've seen some providers, with up to $6,000 per attack mitigation fees. There are some that are substantially less. But the on-demand protection versus the always-on, the difference is that the on-demand protection, most of the providers do have an attack mitigation charge when you need them, and the emergency mitigation starts at $10,000 and up is what we've seen as a general number. So if you choose to go that way, just realize you're gambling. And it can be a lot higher than that, but it really just depends on a lot of factors. Primarily that factor being, again, how much clean traffic, how much bandwidth your website uses on a regular basis, not necessarily when it's under attack. And I do want to let you know that LKCS is partnering with a major DDoS mitigation provider. Those are our plans. We're actually in negotiations currently with two providers, trying to determine which we feel is the best solution for us and our clients. But we are designing a specific solution to include what we feel is really the best of breed solutions and the best features of all the things we've talked about today. So we are expecting to launch an on-demand solution with both always-on and emergency mitigation options. So for those of you that felt an on-demand solution was the best, that's going to be the primary one that we feel we'll offer. But for those of you that need an always-on solution, we're going to have that available as an option. And for those of you that really only want, that want to have peace of mind knowing that in the event of an attack, you can call us and we can mitigate that attack, we are going to provide an emergency mitigation option as well. Our goal is to provide a solution that has an unlimited attack size with absolutely no overage costs. Like I said before, I was shocked at some of the overage costs and how those can add up and really make these solutions that looked, less expensive just become outrageously expensive. So our goal is to provide, a solution that has absolutely no overage costs. And we're hoping to provide one that also provides an unlimited attack size. But as these attacks ramp up in scale, less and less providers are willing to provide an unlimited attack size as well. We do, I feel that we will have a service level agreement guarantee for fast response from our provider, so that when we say that once you start, sending traffic to us, we can start returning clean traffic back to you within 5 to 15 minutes. I'm going to have a firm number on that. So you'll know how long it takes from the time you divert your web traffic to our solution, how long it's going to take for us to get clean traffic back to your website so that your website and home banking services and things can start working again. And we are going to insist that we offer multiple DDoS mitigation technologies to protect all of your web services, all of your applications, regardless of the type of attack, the size of attack, where that attack is generating, all those types of things. So we're going to have a multi-layered approach to DDoS. And we're going to make sure that we do offer a solution for layer 7 SSL mitigation. Again, we know that many of the sites we host and that many of the credit union sites and bank sites that we see out on the internet, the entire site is encrypted with an SSL certificate. Well, that presents specific challenges for DDoS mitigation, and we're going to make sure that we have a solution in place to handle that SSL traffic and be able to clean even those layer 7 application-based attacks where the attack is fully encapsulated in that encrypted stream, so that we can decrypt the attack, identify it, mitigate it, and then provide, re-encrypt the clean traffic and send it back to the web server. We anticipate that our pricing is going to be based on the clean traffic bandwidth. So that means the internet traffic that you're already getting to your website. So again, my goal is not to have any type of overage fee or a fee based on the size of the attack, anything like that. We want to know how much web traffic is going to your website now, and that's the pricing is going to be based on that, and how much traffic clean traffic we're going to return back to your website during an attack. And the goal then is to obviously provide a low monthly cost with as low of a per mitigation fee as we can negotiate. So we think that you'll be best served by not paying for what you don't need. We looked at the numbers earlier and what your opinion was about how, what the likelihood was that you would be attacked in the next 12 months. Well, most of you did not feel that there was a high likelihood of an attack, so why have a high monthly cost? If we can provide our solution, we'll hopefully provide a low monthly cost with a per mitigation fee that you would only have to pay if the site was actually attacked. And then we do want to make sure that there's real-time reporting and post-mitigation reporting available to you. We feel that during an attack, you're going to want as much information as you can get about the attack. So we're going to provide a web control panel for you to actually monitor the attack in real time. And then after that attack is mitigated, provide you with all of the details that we know of the attack, so you have that for your records and to report to your examiners and potentially share with law enforcement and things like that. And obviously our solution already includes a premium DNS hosting option. So as you start to investigate those issues regarding your DNS hosting and the TTL values, that we have a solution that we can host your DNS as part of our DDoS mitigation service and keep those TTLs low, and then be able to flip that traffic for you, potentially if needed during an attack. So either you could flip the traffic or we could flip it, so that all of your web traffic gets diverted to our mitigation solution. And that is my presentation today. So I went a few minutes over the hour, hopefully not too many. But I will stay on the line and answer any questions that come in. And obviously you have my contact information here, so please feel free to call or email me with any questions, and I'd be happy to discuss our solutions and the options that we are planning with you in more detail.